nice food as well.
Vete con Erika. Tú serás un villager también.
Ahí va, Gaby.
Eso es lo que le encanta a ella. Look at that. Look at that knight. Handsome knight.
Right out here, on his balcony, pacing back and forth, and trying to think of a way to solve his lake problem. He paced and he paced, he scratched his head, he scratched his chin, and then his head again, and then his chin again, head, chin, and then his nose because he had an itch, and finally he thought of an idea. He let out a great wicked laugh. And under the cover of darkness that night, he snuck down to the lake. He crept right up to the edge of the lake and knelt down, stuck out his fangs and began to pump his poison into the lake water. He took out his sword and began to stir, getting his poison into every last corner of that lake. The water began to bubble and to boil, to churn and to roil, and soon it began to get darker and darker. The more that serpent's poison spread throughout it, soon the whole lake was full of that thick, dark poison, and the serpent jumped up to his feet, kicked out his legs, waved his arms, and did his most silly, wicked dance all the way back to his dungeon. Now that was very wicked of him, so perhaps we should give him a good boo for being a bad good guy, or a good bad guy. Perfect. And now the next morning, the villagers woke up just like they did every morning. And they went down to the lake yawning and stretching, and they were so sleepy that they didn't even notice anything was wrong. They knelt down beside the lake, and they cupped that water in their hands to get their morning drink, when just then the carrot farmer sniffed that water, threw it back in the lake, jumped back, pinched her nose, and shouted, "Yuck! Pie baker, don't drink that water, it smells awful." Well, the pie baker scratched her head, walked over to sniff that water again. That's you, pie baker. She sniffed it and said, "This smells familiar. This smells like the serpent's poison. Why, if he poisoned the lake, we can't drink it. We can't use it to grow our vegetables. What are we going to do?" And that carrot farmer said, "I know just what to do." And she raised the horn that she wore around her neck and said, "When I was just a young carrot farmer growing much smaller carrots, the unicorn gave me this horn and taught me a tune to play in our hour of greatest need, should we ever need to call her to rescue us, and I think that's it. So I'm going to play this horn, and you're going to look throughout the entire forest for the unicorn so we can greet her properly." And so that carrot farmer took a great deep breath, and she began to play. And the pie baker went running through the forest around the lake, looking everywhere she could think of. High in the tree branches, up in birds' nests, down under bushes. She ran to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, to the northwest, to the southeast, and to the north-south, which isn't even a real direction. And then she began spinning in circles, trying to look everywhere at once. When that didn't work, she walked back to her friend, the carrot farmer, and shook her head and said, "Well, I tried looking everywhere, but I couldn't find the unicorn." Well, the carrot farmer scratched her head and said, "Well, perhaps we need some good magic to make that song work. Let's go to the top of the Crystal Mountain and seek the help of the princesses." And so the carrot farmer led the way towards the Crystal Mountain. And when they got to the bottom of the Crystal Mountain, they stopped and they looked up and up and up and up and up, for it was a sheer cliff face and went on for hundreds of miles straight up into the sky. They scratched their heads before the pie baker realized that she knew an old legend. She took a big step forward, or the carrot farmer did perhaps, knocked on the side of that mountain, and a giant crystal spiral staircase rose out of the side of the mountain. They started climbing those stairs, taking huge steps, for they were carved in the age of the giants. They started climbing and counting those giant stairs. 1, 2, 345, 453, 622. They were nearly to the top, but they were so exhausted and thirsty that they collapsed to the ground, unable to move another inch. And surely that would have been the end of our story if it hadn't have been for this princess right here. out on the side of the mountain picking flowers. When she saw her friends, the carrot farmer and the pie baker, dying on the side of the mountain, she said, "Princesses, come on, we have to go rescue them." They all ran down to the mountainside. They raised their wands over their heads, began twirling them in circles, and clouds began to gather. The clouds got bigger and bigger, and fuller and darker and darker, until what do you think came down out of those clouds? Magic rain! Magic rain began pouring down on those poor, thirsty carrot farmers, pie bakers, and princesses. They were all so refreshed that they cheered for the princesses! You should cheer out there too, that was some good magic. Don't forget you're the audience. And now, the princesses turned to their friends, the bakers and the farmers, and said, "Why did you climb all the way up the mountain with nothing to drink? It's a very long climb, you know." But they shook their heads and said, "We're sorry, we bring you terrible news. For the serpent has poisoned our lake." And when the princesses heard the word serpent, they were so terrified that they screamed. That was a very good scream. We should give them a round of applause for that. And then this little princess, who was right here, turned to the other princesses and said, "Wait a moment. Don't we know a way to summon the unicorn?" They all scratched their heads, and the smallest princess, who was the wisest of all, said, "Oh yes, that's right. We've got a special tune we can whistle to summon the unicorn in our hour of greatest need." But the carrot farmer and the pie baker shook their heads and said, "We've already tried summoning the unicorn, and well, it didn't work." But the princesses all put their hands on their hips and said, "When something doesn't work the first time, you've got to try it again and again. And we are going to try whistling our tune. And while we whistle, we've got to look everywhere all over the mountainside for the unicorn." And so the princesses took a great deep breath, and they began to whistle. And then they all started running all around the mountainside looking for the unicorn. They looked high up in the clouds, and they looked down under crystal rocks. They began looking in really strange places, like over their right shoulder, over their left shoulder, under their left foot, over their right foot. They looked in front of the person, behind them, behind the person, in front of them, and even behind them through their legs. They still couldn't find the unicorn, and were getting so tired and thirsty that when they met back in the middle, shaking their heads, they all almost started crying. But the princesses lifted their wands over their heads and said, "Don't give up hope yet, everyone. Perhaps the unicorn knew what was wrong and has already gone down to the crystal, down the crystal mountain to the lake to purify it. At the very least, our fate awaits us there, so everyone, follow me." And they all went walking back down the crystal mountain through the enchanted forest towards the lake. And now usually the enchanted forest is a lovely place to walk, but it had been drinking that poison through the roots of the trees. And the trees began to go wicked like trolls, so they started playing tricks on all those good people. They lowered their branches, so they all had to duck underneath them so they wouldn't get popped on the head. And then they lifted their roots, so everyone was being tripped by the branches, and they had to step really high to get over the branches. And after hours of traveling like this, they were so tired and sad that when they saw the lake, they ran up to it, saw that it was still nothing but a puddle of poison. And they were so sad that they sat down and they started to cry. It was a terrible sound, but that serpent was happy to hear it. He was out on his balcony here, and he said, "My plan has nearly worked. Now all I've got to do is sneak down to the lake and surprise them all and turn them into my troll army." And so he went sneaking, tiptoeing down around the lake, where nobody saw him because they were still too busy crying. He crouched down behind some ragweed bushes, but that's where he made his mistake. That serpent was terribly allergic to ragweed bushes. He started sneezing. Well, the carrot farmer turned to the princesses and said, "Did you plant sneezing bushes on this side of the kingdom?" The princesses all shook their heads no, and the carrot farmer said, "Then, well, we've got to get into battle formation. Quick, everyone over here!" The princesses lined up shoulder to shoulder right here, and the villagers lined up right in front of them. And the villagers, all by themselves, went tiptoeing towards that bush, pretending they were looking for four-leaf clovers. Well, princesses, you've got to stay behind as the second line of defense. Well, the serpent saw them coming and began holding in that sneeze. He held it in. He held it in, and it got bigger and bigger until he let out the biggest sneeze ever. It was so huge it knocked the villagers flat on the ground. The serpent saw his chance. He jumped up, lifted his sword over his head, but were quicker, they pointed their wands. And the serpent began to shrink. He got smaller and smaller and tinier until you could barely even see him. Well, the villagers stood up, brushed themselves off, and said, "Thank you very much, princesses, but we believe in a fair fight. Do you think you can make him just a little bit bigger?" Well, they pointed their wands again, but they were so tired and thirsty that they lost control of their magic. That serpent grew bigger and bigger until he was 10 feet taller than he should have been. He rushed forward, and there began the greatest slow-motion battle between that wicked serpent and those brave villagers with their fighting carrots and pies. The princesses tried to use their magic, but their wands could only fizzle and pop. They were too thirsty. Well, they fought on and on all through the day until the serpent decided he was tired of being clobbered by carrots and pies, and he thought he would try a trick. He said, "Villagers, look behind you." And when they did, he knocked all the food out of their hands and chopped it to pieces. And then he put down his sword and his shield, wiggled his fingers at everyone there, and hypnotized them all. Their arms went out in front of them like they were sleepwalking, and they all went walking towards the lake, even the princesses. They knelt down beside the lake, for he was hypnotizing them to think that it was crystal clear, pure lake water once again. They knelt by the lake, and they were just about to start drinking it, when the princesses shook their heads and said, "Everyone, we need to try to summon the unicorn one last time. This is our true hour of greatest need." And so the princesses took a great deep breath, and all together they began to whistle their tune once more. Well, that broke the spell, but the serpent would have none of that. He wiggled his fingers once again, casting purple lightning at them all, making them all think that lake was full of grape juice. Why, they were so thirsty they couldn't resist. Their heads got closer and closer to that water. But at that moment, the pie baker turned to the carrot farmer and said, "You've got to try to play that horn once more. This is our last chance." And so she stood up, held that horn, and began to play. Well, the serpent stomped his feet, wiggled his fingers, and cast yellow lightning, making them all think the lake was full of lemonade, with ice cubes floating in it. They couldn't resist. They knelt back down. Their heads got closer and closer to that poison. They were just about to drink, but the song of the villagers and the princesses in their true hour of greatest need reached the ears of the unicorn. The unicorn rushed down to stand between the serpent and the lake. The serpent cast red lightning at the unicorn, pushing her back until her hope was nearly in the water, but she would yield no further. The serpent threw down his arms and rushed at the unicorn, but pierced himself on her horn and collapsed to the ground with a terrible
walking away.
Well, the unicorn turned to the lake and touched it with the tip of her horn, and that water began to bubble and boil once more, until finally it turned right back to the crystal clear lake water it had once been. They all began taking great big gulps of that water, and then they jumped up to their feet and they cheered. And then they saw that the serpent was crawling towards the lake. He said, "Does this lake heal wounds too?" And he jumped in with a great big splash. And when he stood up, a strange thing happened. For the scales melted off his head and they melted off his back. And instead of a serpent, there stood the most brave and handsome knight anyone had ever seen. And that knight began doing something strange. He started kicking out his legs, waving his arms, and doing a silly dance. And the unicorn gave them one last gift, the gift of music. And everyone began making up their own silly dances, jumping up and down, wiggling their arms, spinning in circles. Why, they were so happy they danced this way for 3 whole days before they even got tired. Now go on, I'll wait, this is my favorite part. And then at the end of 3 days, they ran over to the lake, put their arms up over their heads, and let out one last great big cheer. For they turned to face their audience and took a great deep bow. To thunderous applause, let's hear it for all of our wonderful actors and actresses. Good job, ladies and gentlemen. Well, that is the end of our story. And if any of you happen to be wondering how it was that the unicorn was able to purify the lake, it's because her horn stands for the power of truth. And I hope each and every one of you can take some of that magic home with you today. But before you go anywhere, I do actually have